So the whole spiel was lost on the slides. I can skip the slides, but why don't we just continue? If everybody can hear me now, I was wanting to. So Dustin had just opened up with a mention of complicated domains for different people that use MIDCA in the community here or outside. That often um, what he was the main point he was making, or one of them, was that it's the domain that drives the cognitive functions that are necessary, and what the research would then be looking at. And he mentioned Minecraft as being another complicated domain, and how interesting that would be for incorporating into MIDCA. I was starting to say that the domain in the Gators project with underwater vehicles, surface vehicles, the marine world, moose, and that was also a very complicated one. Sravia is starting to look at moose. I was going to ask Ryan whether his experience with moose, I know that was a difficult interface to work with, but have are you still have mixed feelings about how suitable that is for a domain for open research, or can you comment on your experience with Moose and that kind of a domain?
Sure. So Moose is very similar to ROS for those who aren't familiar with it. It's designed for surface and underwater vehicles and is built by MIT. Its main selling points are that it's extremely low computational overhead when compared to a middleware like Moose. Like a middleware like ROS. So it's very simple, but at the base level, it works in exactly the same fashion in that you have a central process. In Moose, it's called MooseDB. In ROS, I can't remember the term now, but the central process through which all the nodes in ROS communicate. On Moose, it's called the MooseDB, and that's the central node in which all of the Moose programs, through which all the Moose programs communicate. So it's really the same. And if the question was more on the technical side, or whether the C domain are good domains, I'm not sure. Mike, could you just clarify on that?
Well, a little of both, but was getting at Moose itself too. For instance, Rabia got the example with the kayak. It's kind of like a little toy example that comes with the simulator and with Moose. She did get that working, but there's no real. Pardon? One of the things that she had a question was like, there's no tutorials on it, and it is very complicated, and you have to kind of like figure out a lot of that on your own. So one question is, is there a tutorial? Yes, I am interested in the C domain itself, and in particular, though, we're also interested in feedback on Moose, or things to look out for is also of helpful. Maybe that's a offline conversation, but she had another comment. Shravya, why don't I let you speak it though?
Yeah, I just have the simple question, like, can Moose communicate with other applications rather than .moose files or .moose applications?
No. I mean, you could create an interface, but it's not designed to communicate with other applications. It's designed to run in its own little isolation on a craft out on the ocean. On the topic of tutorials and so forth, there is actually some resources available. I did have some trouble finding them myself, though, and sort of stumbled upon them after I'd already started. They are out there, and in addition to them, I'll send you a link if you want.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
There's a large number of missions, example missions in there, which each have their own page describing what they're actually doing. And if you sort of work your way through, they increase in difficulty as you go along. You can sort of piece things together that way as well. So I'll email you that information, which should be helpful.
Sure.
Well, I also wanted to comment while we're at it on the domain, and not just the domain. I'm sorry, Ryan's presentation, and a number of them this year have been about what metacognition, how you can think about metacognition when you're in a domain, and the problem of power management. Well, Martin mentioned that to me before, but until your presentation, it didn't dawn on me how that really is a metacognitive problem. And so I thought that raised a bunch of interesting questions when you had that the simple way you could do it versus the variable iteration and the trade-off there. It would be interesting to see if you can measure that trade-off, how there is extra overhead maybe for the variable rate. It seemed like you suggested where the simpler one, you had less overhead. And in fact, the overhead might cause more power drain trying to do the variable iterations. So there's maybe a sweet spot in certain kinds of problems or something. Can you comment on that?
You're still muted, Ryan. Sorry.
Sorry, I presented two of the main umbrella sort of approaches there. We should be receiving hardware in the next couple of weeks where I'll actually be able to start getting some metrics on the power draw of these processes. What I'm expecting is that the computational complexity of either process is going to be absolutely negligible compared to the iteration rate of the cognitive process itself. So I believe the variable is going to be by far the more desirable. So,
I actually just going off of that. Can you just mute yourself, Ryan? We just get a little feedback from it. If you don't, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's great. So, Mike, that made me think about so talking about metacognition and power management. I haven't really been thinking about. So a lot of times we talk about resources in the world, but I haven't necessarily thought about resources at the cognitive level. So I almost wonder if power or energy is a resource that we might be able to think about mental actions consuming. So, maybe planning is a resource, like a resource heavy mental action, or where this might come into play actually is when we swap modules. So actually in the last MIDCA workshop, we had an example where the metacognition actually swaps in a different planner because the first planner was unable to achieve a goal. It's interesting. What if we swapped planners because one planner was less resource intensive? So I haven't really been thinking about resources at the cognitive level. So I that's really interesting, I think, for future work.
Yeah, actually, just to comment on that, the swapping out the planners for power management was actually one of the first places I went to. I came to the conclusion basically that having the cognitive loop try to decide how much planning is necessary, and having multiple planners seemed like a very difficult job to keep all of those planners functioning, the code, well-written code maintained, so forth. So the path I took was instead to have one planner that does the best job and then give it more or less power depending on how much stress it's under. And a good planner, as I'm sure most people would agree with me, should not take the same amount of time for a simple problem that it does for a complex problem. So it should just find the shortest path. And whether that path is short or whether it's long depends on the actual problem itself. So one planner with hardware agnostic sort of capabilities is what I was going for.
Thanks, Ryan. That's interesting. Does anybody else have any things that you thought was interesting, or questions or anything? Or any of you want to take a stab at what you think an architectural commitment should be for MIDCA, or my slide?
Sure. Anybody? Well, I'm going to stay with Gators and some comments. So Martin's there, right? We have Martin. Okay, yeah. So I had promised you, Martin, in our last telecon, I had promised this example we had talked about that I was toying with, which was the mine clearance and the queue route and so forth. I actually did put together some on that and showed them to the students that are working on Gators. We talked about that, and I had told you I was going to send them to you. I've got really about 10 more minutes worth of work, but then I went on vacation. So expect that, and I don't know that that's anything that we're planning to do as is. I see it as a talking point, though, for how explanation might fit into some of the tasks that would be related to, because you had suggested that mine clearance might be one of the problems they look at actually with one of the Remus platforms if the deep ray glider wasn't ready in November. And anyhow, so this mine clearance amphibious kind of thing, I was going to send you the slides to PowerPoint, and maybe we can then talk some more about that. But I would like to look for ways that explanation might be able to contribute, or it's at least have some synergy with what you guys are doing there in Adelaide. So
yeah, hi, Mike. Yeah, that is still the intention with Autonomous Warrior. The Deep Ray Glider, or the Sunray, which is the prototype, won't be ready, but the DST Everly people in Sydney have more experience with mine countermeasures, and will be doing something at the exercise with that. So it might be possible to do something there, but certainly incorporating explanation into the things, something that we're interested in longer term as well as in the short term.
also, I believe, let me see if we got this. Yes, can you hear me? Yep. Okay, so I also think that the problem of the battery, because you had mentioned it before in our last talk, that Ryan was looking at power management issues, and now I'm excited about it. So I think that is something, right? You expect maybe the power to be a certain level, but you've done more computation than what had been normal, and you have less power, and that might then be an anomaly for us, and we could have some explanation that would, in the GDA sense, trying to use our version of MIDCA, generate a goal to do something in the power management realm. But what would be helpful would be if you had a particular scenario that you're playing with, Ryan, or you guys have, that illustrate also the power at a high level, what would be occurring, like in terms of events in the scenario, and the branches that might happen. If it did one thing, this is what would happen if it did something else, and that just gives us kind of something to help us think about that in the same vein as what we were doing with this mine clearance problem. But so later on, I think I'm just asking, this is just to say I'm asking Ryan and you to, if you have an example scenario that's just in a text file that says this is an example, that would be that'd be useful for us.
There is no example in the text file at the moment. In the simulations, it's just running full power all the time, which is, it is possible because it is a simulation. But it's something that's been identified will be an issue. So that's what we've sort of, that's how we came up with the idea to make sure we had a plan in place for when this actually happens. The examples of when you want to really crunch numbers might be at the start of the mission. It's been given a bunch of goals. It's starting with a blank slate. It takes quite a bit of crunching to find plans to achieve all those goals, to order the plans, so forth. Once that's in place, it can then go to a lower stress mode, which then shuts down some cores, shuts down some of the CPU frequency. Because at that stage, it might just be refining the mission. It's got a workable mission. It's just seeing if it can come up with a better one. And that's not something that really needs to drain the battery for. So that's sort of the two different concepts that we're working with. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, this is being recorded. Oh, it is. Yeah. That's great. Okay. Well, so this has been really specific to Gator, so maybe we can broaden it to, or
you guys have any thoughts or anything that So right, okay, yeah, we're not really. I was kind of just asking if anybody here had any questions or comments or anything. I would just like to note, so I started working with James Boggs, who's doing the Rebel Agents with MIDCA about like 2 or 3 months ago. He was working with someone else at the Naval Research Lab who ended up taking another position, and so I'm working with him now. And first of all, I just want to say, for all of us using MIDCA, it's pretty exciting because he has a multi-agent setup and they communicate, which I believe is the first example of multi-agent MIDCA scenario. And I also just think Rebellion, so it's surprising how, so I did a brief survey of trying to find work on it, and there really has not been a lot of empirical experiments run with Rebellion, and Rebellion just seems so interesting and so useful, because so many times humans, mess with robots, or they give a goal, but there's really some like the comic that Mike mentioned, like a goal or a task, your motives to it, or it might violate some ethics. And I think that's something so interesting. I mean, I think that's a great, so I'm interested in goal transformation, and I was talking to Stravia about all the goal operations and deciding when you should. Yeah, and Travi was talking about goal types and this stuff, and so I think that Rebellion is a great situation where you might want to do goal transformation, because suppose your own a robot has an owner and its owner tells it to do something, but it violates the ethical policy of the agent. The agent probably just shouldn't do nothing. It should probably do something. So some kind of goal reasoning to transform to maybe do a similar goal. Anyway, I just think this could give us a lot of context for at least myself and Stravia and those interested in working on this area of goal transformation and using goal operations. There could be some rich scenarios here, I think, for research.
Well, my comment to that too is, we had some evidence. We had talked about, where does the reasoning about goals exist? Does it exist at the cognitive level or at the metacognitive level? And with us, I think, Strawberry, you were on it as well, but it was your work mainly where you argued that that kind of an operation to change the goal kind of belong, because you're reasoning about goals and the benefits about it would belong at the metacognitive level. We had some evidence, but then there was a trade-off there, actually, and I don't know that it's clear. That's a big question, I think. James was using eval. I would think we argued about that over the first break, whether it might be actually not eval, because we something else. But whether it's an interpret or even an intend, but reasoning about the goal might, because he did claim it's metacognitive too, reasoning about the goal. So we have a little bit of evidence from that paper, but that was, we kind of set it up to do it that way. We kind of knew what we were illustrating the trade-off. So a more hard look at, if you're going to reason about goals, there's different things to reason about goals that are given to you, or goals that you generate or that you're selecting, and trying to make decisions about that. Is that metacognitive, or in what phase or what process be in charge of that? That's actually, nobody really thinks hard about that, and there is no real, you can't go to the literature and say, oh well, here, these guys say that and they say this and I believe them.
I would like to comment on that. And so Mike, that's excellent. So I really like that work that we did, and I think it comes down to, so you talked about whether or not the trade-off between having goals having like goal reasoning happen or goal transformation happen at the metacognitive level versus the cognitive level. And so in the work that we did, we basically implemented a planner that would take a world state and a goal, and if it couldn't achieve that goal, it would actually just come up with a different plan that would technically achieve a slightly different goal, but the goal itself wasn't explicitly being reasoned about. So it was just within planning knowledge, the equivalent of goal transformation was happening. So and the example I'm talking about was, just to make it a little easier, is that there were two types of block towers that could be built, and one of them used a resource like cement in between, and another one didn't. It just set the blocks on top. So the original goal was to use cement, but if there wasn't any cement available, it would just stack the blocks. And so that's interesting, because the plan that was coming out wasn't achieving the original goal. But the most important thing, I think, is that I think in goal reason, I think we really do want to treat goals as like first class objects that we want to keep explicit and reason about. And I think if we're going to do that, I think it falls at the metacognitive layer, because a goal is a goal is something internal. Even though a goal is a world state, it's something the agent has about the world state. So yeah, and this is where it gets a little tricky, where it's like, should it be meta or should it just be in the cognitive level? But I think I think this is the case. If you're going to change any knowledge that the agent has, or anything in memory that the agent has, that should generally be considered meta. And so because goal transformations are changing the agent's goals, it's an operation that's happening cognitive state. And yeah, that's right. Oh yeah.
I got excited here. I'm just taken and saying, though, that most of the AI, I mean, the bulk of the AI community does do all of these things. In the goal reasoning community, very few of us have this meta layer and try to represent it that way. So they actually have code that is doing some reasoning there. So I have written when I was in Prodigy. I mean, I wrote things that would, in effect, reason about the goals, but it is a little slippery. And I also would say that, this is a strong cognitive point of view, right? There's the people, what is it? The situated cognition. People say everything is really in the world. So did the behaviorists as well. But a good cognitivist would say everything is in our head. We have representations of things in the world. We have things light waves impinge on the eyes, but we have images that our brain interprets, and we have memories of things. Everything is actually cognitive. And then we should be a philosopher, I guess. But it is important to, though, computationally and look empirically at what would be the benefit of doing it at one level versus the other, and examine that a little bit more rigorously.
So I don't want to like hog too much of the discussion if any of you want to jump in, but so just going off of this, I think that in just the work that we had done, where it was the goal reasoning, the goal transformation was happening inside the planner, you basically needed an expert to you needed that planning domain knowledge in there in terms of the operators. And that's why I think part of what I mentioned in my talk was this vision that like we could in the future, when we have fully a lot more capabilities in MIDCA, you could design a cognitive agent. You specify what kind of cognitive modules you get and all that stuff, and then you can get a bunch of things for free. And one of the things you could get for free is if you specify kind of a ontology of goals, or all the different kinds of goals, or maybe it's just an ontology of world states, and from there you infer possible goals. But you could have general search mechanisms that decide if at any point in time, if any goal is unachievable, and that seems to fit in the metacognitive, and because it's explicit and goals are objects that we can change and operate, then I think we can get general capability that can apply.
I just want to say, when you want to decide which goal is achievable is based on the states in the world, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, right. So this is this is a great point. I think so even though the meta level is concerned with the cognitive level, and the cognitive level is concerned with the world, you can't get away from the world in the meta level. And you could argue that technically inside, because in MIDCA's memory, there's an internal world state. So MIDCA is perceiving the world, but it has its own, like in its memory, it has its own state of the world. It's actually not the state of the world. The state of the world is like its own grounded thing that we get something that resembles it through perception. And metacognition, I don't think is going to be able to get away from that. It's going to have to use, like, you're going to have to know real values of what's in the world at any point in state to do these things, like to know that a goal is unachievable. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Ryan and Martin, and do you guys have any discussion items? Anything? Any comments or questions you had?
Yeah. Hi, it's Martin here. I mentioned the Dustin in the break, but most of the rest of you probably wouldn't be aware. We've also had a third colleague of ours and friend, Chris Novak. So I don't have any questions as such, but I was going to make a comment about James's talk, and I guess you've already covered some of that. But I also thought it was interesting, the idea of rebellious agents. We heard David Ahar talk a bit about that when he was here back in September after the IDCA conference. But Chris is starting to look at representations for legal and ethical issues, because in the military, apart from the ethical issues which you've already discussed, and they don't have to be in the military domain or the defence domain, there's also things like the law of armed conflict and other legal requirements that agents would be, or or capabilities would be required to observe. So I don't think we've, or even Chris has necessarily thought about how some of these things could be implemented, but the idea of the rebellious agents maybe having, well, keeping a focus on what's going on and having the ability to intervene on the more standard processing might be an interesting thing to continue to pursue.
Yeah, so related to that too, and certainly the ethical questions I have not tackled before, but that would relate to when you're reasoning about a goal. And James argued for that, though there are some distinctions that came to me when his have a chance to raise. I believe I talked with Zora about them over one of the breaks. So I could imagine if my superior during wartime, there are rules, as you suggest, about what is legal, what's ethical, and soldiers, if they're ordered to shoot a civilian, can refuse an order. You know, they're supposed to not argue about orders and just do that. But I think there are cases where rules about that. So if I had the goal given to me, shoot a civilian, well, I should be the rebel, and maybe I can cite Geneva Accords or something that is kind of clear. But he was talking about also where I have the orders to defend myself when people are shooting at me or shoot the enemy or whatever. And those rules, that's but so the point I want to make is, though, the reasoning about the casualties when there's civilians that would have side effect, now you're also reasoning about the plans and the execution of the plans as well as the goals. So it deals with planning and not just reasoning about the goals. So there is, what is planning versus what is the goal reasoning, or for a rebel agent. I think that is often we easily can mix the two. And so actions have effects, and we need to think about that, but goals don't have actions yet till you do the planning. Now, you may know about arguments of predicates when it's if it's going to be, I said shoot, but it's when the goal is to have destroyed the enemy military, armed forces, versus to destroy the civilian. So that is the goal. That's the reasoning about the goal. It's and the goal arguments. But then when it's starting to think about the side effects of the plans that achieve the goals, then there's actually more to it, and there's a little distinction there that is important, whether ethics are involved or not.
I just want to say that's really interesting, Mike. So most of the time, goals tend to be subsets of world states, and it's interesting. I don't know. I feel like in the goal reasoning, I haven't heard much of, or
put a block on the red block, and then it's a variable. It's not a concrete one, so it can be variablized.
Okay, Mike just made a comment that they can be variablized, so kind of like lifted states or something. Yeah, not grounded. But I just mean, so and actually, yeah. So a lot of times when we specify a goal, oftentimes there's the state is much bigger, and there's just one. So like even with the Baxter and the blocks, there are like 4 or 5 blocks on the table, and you give it a goal to stack 2 of them. But the goal doesn't say anything about the other ones, but maybe you have ethical policy, and it's just really interesting that there's, so like in James' example, like what you were saying, right? So to reach the goal, a civilian would be killed, but that's not specified anywhere. So it's almost like you need an inference. Yeah. Right, about the plan. Right.
I was just starting to, I get excited here, right? So I was starting to say, though, you can put costs to actions. And if you want a cheaper plan and you just give certain actions like to harm a civilian has a higher cost, including a legal cost or ethical cost, your conscience, maybe if you're, but I don't, forget that. Anyhow, there's a cost and you want to minimize the cost. You want to choose ones that allow it, or there's other ways. And then it's part of the planning operator knowledge. And it's a planning problem. So, or you can solve it that way too. It'd be interesting to see how much you can do at the goal, because I could have certain information about goal types. As Robbie was talking about goal types, we haven't really started using an ontology for the predicates and classes. But there could be certain goals, like destroying something is a different type than on or next to, where I'm in a different class of a goal. And I could learn that certain kinds of goals, the plans associated with them just tend to be costly or negative or have an ethical implication without having to do the planning yet. And I could kind of have associations with goals without, to avoid having to do the planning. So there is, a bunch of good things.
Yeah, I just want to say, so I sometimes forget how intimately connected plans are to goals. And you can imagine an agent that has a lot of pending goals, and as it's moving around in the environment, the amount of actions they need to take the goal would be changing. So it's almost like if you had a bunch of goals, you would constantly want to be monitoring how much effort it's going to be able to take to achieve those goals. But then you might be doing just so much unnecessary planning, and just linking those. I think that's an important thing to consider in doing goal reasoning is what kind of plan is going to take me from the current state, and if that leads to like opportunities, right? So if all of a sudden it's very easy to achieve a goal, maybe that increases its priority. And I don't know, we don't have anything right now that, no. Yeah. Mike said that was an interesting statement. Which the opportunities?
That it changes the opportunities for goal selection as you're doing planning. Well, I haven't thought of that.
Yeah. Well, we are around 7:45 or 7:46 here, which means it's probably like 11:15 a.m. Adelaide time. Yep. So we're kind of in towards the closing. Yeah, if you guys want to say something, or
yeah, I was just going to make a comment about the quality of the visually, that is, of the presentations this year as opposed to last year. It's viewing things remotely. It's actually been a lot better. There have been some issues with Prezi, and you've probably experienced those too. So that didn't quite work so well. But this year, the content on the slides was really clear, and the sound quality was a whole lot better on generally. Yeah, so well done, and thanks for organising it, Dustin.
Thank you.
That's great. That's great to know. So this is our first time having remote speakers and also having speakers from the other side of the planet. So, which is great. So yeah.
Okay, so this is more because I know that we're finishing up here, but I wanted to just kind of let the Australians, the Aussies know, as well as some of the others here that work on the periphery of. We actually have some people here today that work on the different projects that aren't MIDCA, but I did get to talk about how there is some intersections here that may or may not be as apparent, but there's some interesting work that's starting to happen because we've done, and Sravia kind of mentioned it, that some of the goal operations that we do, like goal selection was done in the intend phase in her master's thesis, kind of looked at that in isolation and assumed that goal formulation wasn't happening at the same time and that these other goal operations, goal change didn't happen at the same time. It was just selection, and you studied that in kind of isolation. And now we're starting to look at, well, what do you do if you had the choice of, you got to pick, you have 10 goals and I got to choose some, or I could change the goal, maybe if I can't do them all, or there's, new goals coming up. How does that change my selection problem? And you just mentioned right now, as I plan for a certain goal, things may become, all of a sudden, the world changes that makes opportunities that I may want to take advantage of, or opportunities to do some goals I'm not currently working on, or so it gets complicated. But so this, and goal monitoring as well. So I've got 3 students that are now starting to do things that relate to different goal operations, and their work is starting to integrate, and the issues are overlapping, where there's going to be some, I'm excited about it. I think there's going to be some interesting possibilities that will arise. Well, we'll see how it plays out, but the kind of reasons that you have to achieving a goal, you want to monitor, but those reasons comes from explanations. So Zora's doing the monitoring. Explanation is starting to be done by Sampath, but those explanations can help with formulation. The whole selection task can be, I think, also informed by causal explanation, and you actually might metacognitively want to reason about what would be a simpler task, because I can't think about this forever, or I'm going to run out of battery juice, right? Or I'm going to run out of time. Time itself is a resource. Now, I don't know that we'll solve everything happening at the same time, but at least pairwise, we're going to start to look at some of the operations. If you have choices that happen pairwise at the same time, now what do you do? And I have high expectations that I hope my observations of their research will sync and will be a positive surprise. Okay.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, I'm just gonna wrap it up. I'm just gonna make a few comments. Before I do, is there anything do Ryan and Martin and Chris, do any of you want to make any last comments or anything, or anything? No. Yeah, Shavia.
I just had this simple comment, like uh, we are like when I was talking with Dustin, we were talking about the domains, and he was talking about the Minecraft domain and another video game domain which he wants to integrate onto the MIDCA. So I would like to add this, that instead of building newer domains to do our tasks, like Dustin has implemented expectations in and beacon domain, and I have implemented the selection in construction and restaurant domain. So I think that rather than building different domains for our different tasks, uh, we should try to implement all of our tasks into a single domain, which is kind of generic. That might help the to be more faster pace or something. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. This is a great comment, Stravia. I think that to really do great goal reasoning research, we need rich domains. We need like a large variety of goals, and that's where you get really interesting behavior. And I think that's one place goal reasoning will shine. So I definitely am in agreement with that. And so I just want to say thank you so much for everyone joining us for this. The talks were great. I learned a lot, and I hope you all enjoyed them. And so what's great, and so I feel like we definitely met our objectives for this workshop. We brought in, we got to hear from the folks from Australia, Ryan and Martin and Chris, and James about Rebel Agents from New York. So it's so cool to see some outside groups using MIDCA. And and so I've kind of transitioned to the Naval Research Lab in Washington, and so now I'm kind of an outside group from the original core hub of MIDCA. And so I just before we go, I want to take kind of another shameless plug that please feel free to update the website, and also please feel free. It's an open source project. If you see some code that you're like, that could probably be modified to be a little better, do it. You can do it. You have the freedom. So I'm motivating. If any of you are ever bored and you're like, oh, I just want to do some coding, go on MIDCA and look through some files, and I'm sure you'll find something you think you could improve. So that's and also just remember, if MIDCA becomes better and more popular, more robust, we all get more citations. So yeah. So I just want to say thank you all, and I think we'll definitely do this again next year. And I think we met our objectives, and thank you all for joining. I think that's it. So yeah. Yeah, Martin, if you want to say something, or yeah, yeah. I think.
Yeah, no, I was just going to reiterate my thanks for you putting it all together, Justin, and hopefully I'll see you in a few months' time.
Speaking of which, I was going to ask you that you were still thinking about coming for the symposia, the AAAI Spring Symposium?
Yeah, that's still the case, Mike. That's right.
Okay, I look forward to that. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for joining. We'll see you later.
Thank you.
Okay. See you.
Yeah.